we are on to the penultimate sin, all right? Now, in most classifications of the 7 deadly sins, lust comes last. It is the least terrible of the sins. Sometimes it's the most terrible, but for medieval commentators, mostly it's the least terrible. Why is it the least terrible? Well, you might remember last week when we talked about Thomas Aquinas, there was a certain taxonomy where lust is maybe seen as, it's the least kind of temptation. You're just tempted by other bodies, other people. You're not tempted by the great things of God. You're not corrupting the good of God. You're corrupting the good of other people, which is, of course, still bad. It's still a deadly sin. But in Dante's formulation of Mount Purgatory, it is the last sin to be purged. Now, there are problems with lust, huge problems that we need to encounter straight away. What is the difference between lust and love? What does it look like, this difference and this distinction? And of course, the entire history of lust, you might argue, is a way of lending a moral framework to the question of sexuality or love, of deeming what kinds of love are acceptable and not what kinds of love are unacceptable, what kinds of sexual activity are acceptable and unacceptable. Where do you build a fence and say, beyond this is immoral? Well, to ask the question of lust and love, first of all, and I think the boundaries will be much more fluid than we thought for medieval thinkers. And you're going to see some extraordinary examples, like shocking. For me, some of the most shocking literature that's ever been written is in this presentation, and you'll see it a little bit later, in terms of that boundary between lust and love. And shocking because it's also the boundary between self, other, and God, which is part of that equation. How does that work? You'll have to wait about 32 minutes. Okay, but if for example, you look at this first image on the slides, lust and love. These are composite images of faces, and one of them is a face in love, and one of them is a face in lust. Which one's which? So these are researchers who interviewed, hundreds of people in different states and photographed their faces surreptitiously. And apparently there's a composite. And apparently I think, should know the difference. It should be subliminal for us to know. If one of these people is only after our body, and one of these people is after all of us as a being, which one is which? Eliana, which one is which? It's 50-50. Oh, it's 50-50, Eliana. So your guess is... I'm sorry to put you on the spot.
I don't know.
You can pass the mic.
Those who are on the right side are in love, and those who are on the left side are in love.
Okay, so...
I have an opposite opinion.
Okay, so brilliant. I wonder what the students think. We have two opinions. We have the Anastasia school of thought, which is the right-hand side is in love, and the left-hand side is in lust.
So those who are
I actually agree with us.
Okay, so we have this side of the room feels one way, and this side of the room feels the other. I can tell you, I don't know how much of a difference this makes, but I can tell you that this side of the room is correct. This left image, apparently they're looking for love. They are lovers. The right image, they are looking for lust. They are lusters, if you like. Not a word we have. They are lascivious. Okay, so I don't know what that tells you about your own minds and you two students. But I suppose there are several points to make here. One of them is, actually, it's pretty difficult to tell, I can see. Two, I suppose, we're trying to assess some motive here, and where do they break down? We're trying to assess the difference between somebody who wants just your body and someone who wants your heart or mind. What is the difference? I mean, I think a lot of philosophers of love would say it's the same thing. There's no problem. The difference is, of course, that certain moral codes make this absolutely essential, on the one hand. And then, on the other hand, interestingly enough, there are certain researchers in the sciences who would tell us, actually, there are totally different chemical compounds and different hormones and different parts of the brain involved in the left image to the right image, which is interesting too. Look, we will get there. I just want to introduce two theories of love, and maybe you can decide which one you prefer. There are two theories of love here. Obviously, there are millions of theories of love, but there are just two that I've plucked out that I enjoy the most, and I think that could frame our discussion. One is Stendhal, French writer, writing quite a long time ago, and his view of crystallization. He observed this when he watched. He was on a retreat with some friends, and he watched as one guy started to fall in love with one of the women they were on a retreat with. And he found it extraordinary. And he came up with this model of crystallization. It's like, how is it that this, and he describes, perfectly ordinary woman suddenly, over the course of a weekend, to his friend becomes magical, something more than, something else. And he thought of this in terms of crystallization, like the way ice or frost, right there in Tumen outside, ice or frost appears on a branch, something magical extra which we add to the other. So when you encounter the other in love, for Stendhal, you are adding something. You see more than. Maybe it's someone's potential, or maybe it's your fantasy, or maybe it's some combination of the two. But you're not, the point, I suppose, is you're not seeing the branch in this. You're seeing something magical on top of the branch. Now, this can become quite a cynical view of love. Like 2 years' time, the hormones will wear off, the magic will wear off, and you'll just see this withered branch of this person, and you're, what did I ever see in them? So that's one model. I hope this is not true for any of us, obviously. That's one model, right, of love, crystallization. I suppose the point there is we see something more than the person. Now, what about Alain Badiou, the event? Smash, breaking through glass. The idea for Badiou, and it's a complicated theory, and he puts love as an event, much like a political revolution. What does this mean? It smashes you to pieces. Love is something which breaks you apart and puts you back together again. This is the other theory. So what does this mean, this event? Well, it's interesting for Badiou. An event is something which reconstitutes something, all right? So after a revolution, all of history for that particular place looks different now. It was leading up to revolution. Nothing will ever be the same again. Likewise for Badiou, when you fall in love, and again, I hope this is true, or at least, when you fall in love, it seems like it's fate, right? It seems destiny. It had to happen that way because my life was leading up to falling in love in this way. Now, you might not believe me, or you might believe me too much. This is how a lot of people describe the situation of love as this fated experience. And so I suppose the difference with Stendhal in this view of love, this event love, is you are not the same. And I suppose the point is that, well, we'll talk about it a little bit later, but falling in love for Badiou is a process of your own undoing. You become something else. You're transformed. You're not the same. For other theorists like Kant, love is like this contract between two people. Like, I stay the same, you stay the same, but now we have a contract. Kant was terrible. He said it was a contract for the mutual use of sex organs. That was marriage. It's so romantic. This is not a contract. This is, neither of us are the same again. We have been broken to pieces. And I suppose for Badiou, and this is where it gets a little bit, a little bit beautiful. For Badiou, you become two in this process. And to become two, you need to accommodate a space within yourself for the other. And the other accommodates a space within themselves for you. Not like Stendhal, where you're seeing something on top of the other. For Badiou, you are reconstituting the other in love. And you are really ultimately seeing them for what they are. Two exciting views of love. These are modern views, though, of course. We are going to go into the medieval. We're going to see how these resonate through different thinkers across that 1,000 years in pretty exciting ways. I do think that it's not a coincidence that this is a medieval lecture. I mean, I would have done it as a medieval lecture anyway. But I do think this is an era of extraordinary innovation and creative imagination about love. And that's why I think that's one of the great things the Middle Ages did give to European culture, was an immensely rich idea of love, which is totally the opposite of Kant's contract. Okay, in this lecture then, guys, here are the colourful squares. These are the 5 things, very briefly, some of them, that we're going to do. We're going to look at agony in love, pain, which, according to who you believe, is either completely essential to love or completely the enemy of love. Pain and agony. We'll look at Cupid. Then we'll look at temptation. We are looking at medieval Christian writers, after all. There's a lot of stuff written about temptation. A lot of really harsh things written too. We'll have to get through that. Misogyny is coming. Then we will look at anxiety, lack, and play. Lack is, do you love because you lack something? That's the mystery we need to look at there. And different writers have very different views. And of course, we are talking about lust in all of this. Do you lust because you lack something too? Anxiety is about lust Anxiety is about sexuality, we will look at. And finally, play. We'll end on play, I think. So let's start with agony then. Do you feel agony when you... Sorry, I shouldn't ask it. Do you feel agony? Have you felt agony in love? What does this mean? Or is agony only about desire, which we might see as less than love? But some theorists, right, would say, no, love is the real thing. Love is the person who cares for you, no matter what state you're in. You know, you've got a cold, you're at home, you look terrible, you're boring, you know, because you haven't left the house for 2 weeks. The lover is the person who still cares then, right? You know, that's one view of love, right? Whereas desire is maybe this imaginative thing where you're only interested in someone in a sexual way. Is there agony involved in desire? We should think about Cupid. Or Eros. The first god, by the way, in Greek mythology, Eros is created out of chaos. Before all the other gods, there is Eros, which is interesting. Cupid, the thing we should remember about Cupid, of course, is he does have an arrow. It is a wound that he makes. You remember in Greek and Roman, of course, Roman mythology calls him Cupid. In Greek and Roman mythology, it's Cupid's arrow, isn't it, that pierces you. You get a wound and you fall in love, but there is a wound. There is something that hurts you in that process. I think that's quite important to think about. So let's look at the Metamorphoses, I think it is, the story of Cupid and the story of Venus and Adonis. For a while, and this is the story of where Venus is, she's with Cupid and then she gets hurt. Part of Cupid's arrow accidentally brushes her. She gets the wound. She falls in love with Adonis, and it's tragic. For while the boy Cupid with quiver on shoulder was kissing his mother, he innocently scratched her breast with a loose arrow. The injured goddess pushed her son away, but the wound he had given was deeper than it seemed and deceived her at first. Now captured by mortal beauty, she even forgoes the heavens, preferring Adonis to heaven. Right, so it's a pretty simple situation. She's with Cupid's kissing his mother, nothing strange about that, and then she gets the arrow wound. Notice it is injured. She's injured by this. It's not just, oh, I was tickled by the arrow. She's properly injured. And you can see she has symptoms of a kind of illness. Right? She can't, she's deceived. She's captured by mortal beauty. She forgoes the heavens. She prefers Adonis to heaven. Now, this is an important element of this being wounded by love, or desire, shall we say, that it's doomed, the doomed element. And think of all the love stories. I mean, any good love story that you've ever seen that isn't a comedy, a romantic comedy, a lot of them do end in pretty terrible ways, right? Romeo and Juliet, the mutual suicide. Othello is, of course, a tragedy, the other Shakespeare play. You know, there's a deep love, but of course it's tragic. Okay, and of course it's tragic for Venus. She falls in love with Adonis. Adonis gets gored by a bull. The bull apparently just wanted to caress Adonis. It was all a misunderstanding. Forgot how sharp his horns were. And Adonis dies. This is a classic myth. It was very popular in the Middle Ages, that myth of being punctured by a wound of love, falling in love, it hurts, and then of course it's tragic. Love, lust. And it makes us ask the question, is desire doomed? Is desire in the Western imagination something that is doomed? If you call something lust, do you already say it's doomed? This is not going to work. It's lust because it's unsustainable, it's doomed, and I know it's kind of bad. Well, Cleopatra is another. I should have asked you who this is. She doesn't look anything like Cleopatra, does she? But this is Cleopatra, as imagined in the Middle Ages. And again, it's one of these stories of a tragic love, a love that consumes, and that's important, a love that consumes, a desire love, that wasn't built to last. She falls in love with Antony, of course, and it's tragic. Their armies, they rule together as king and queen, and their armies fail, right? And Antony is killed. And what does Cleopatra do? Well, in some forms of the myth, you remember she takes a snake, a poisonous snake, and kills herself. Apparently it's not possible for her to have died in this, but it's usually a snake, which you can imagine what this symbolizes. There is a phallic dimension. These medieval images are pretty horrifying, aren't they? Geoffrey Chaucer, who you remember, Zoomers, from reading last week, Chaucer writes the legend of Cleopatra in the Middle Ages, in the 14th century, and he describes it really wonderfully. And he gets across that agony of desire, that pain, the desire that can only be quenched, I suppose, through suicide in instance. Here we go. Let's see Chaucer doing this story. This is Cleopatra speaking. Irreproachable my wifehood always, the same would I suffer, life or death. And that covenant while lasts my breath I will fulfill. It will be clearly seen, was never to her lover a truer queen. She's saying, look, I've always been a great wife, and just because, life or death, I will suffer the same. I'll do the same thing. It is suffering, you see. And that covenant while lasts my breath I will fulfill. So I'll do my duty as a lover, regardless if it sends me to death. And with these words, with firm heart, naked, among the serpents into the pit she leapt, and there she chose to make her ending. Anon the vipers her began to sting, and she her death received with good cheer for love of Antony, to her so dear. Guys, I don't know how much in love any of you have ever been. This would be just a bridge too far for me. I don't know about you. Just a little bit too far. I don't think I could die with good cheer, covered in snakes and snake bites, for my dead lover. No, I did. Well, I shouldn't say that. Look, never say never. Never say never. But look, it's pretty extreme, isn't it? It's pretty extreme. Several things. Yes, we can talk about the doomed nature of love, or a certain kind of unsustainable love. Is it more pure than good love? Is it more pure, this love, because it ends in disaster and death? Does it seem more pure than the kind of everyday love of marriage? Or is it just an important myth to remind us of the dangers of lust, the dangers of a heady desire that cannot be fulfilled, that cannot be sustained? You'll throw yourself into the snake pit if you do it. Lastly, Helen of Troy, just for all of these images of these kind of, and you see, obviously, there's a fear of attractive women, isn't there? There's this myth that's coming about the dangers of an attractive woman, that an attractive woman will lead you to destruction or death, that your desire is dangerous to you. Helen of Troy is a good example of that. Of course, she was, you remember Christopher Marlowe. Zoomers, you'll remember a few weeks ago we did Dr. Faustus by Christopher Marlowe. Famous line near the end of that play, as he talks about Helen of Troy, Faustus gets to see Helen of Troy and said, "Is this the face that launched 1,000 ships?" It's a famous line. Helen was so beautiful, she looked like a goddess, and this was why she was dangerous, according to myth. Homer, in his Iliad, describes it. Who on earth could blame them? Because what happens is all of these soldiers go into battle to fight for Helen, and they all die, or many of them die. Who on earth could blame them? No wonder the men of Troy and Argives under arms have suffered years of agony, all for her. For such a woman, beauty, terrible beauty, a deathless goddess, so she strikes our eyes. Frightening, isn't it? Okay, so blame Helen. Don't blame anyone else. Blame Helen. You see, this is blaming the attractive woman. And then you have Ovid, surely there is no blame on Trojans. If for a long time they suffer hardships for a woman like this one, terrible is the likeness of her face to immortal goddesses. Still, though she be such, let her go away in the ships, lest she be left behind, a grief to us and our children. That last line's fantastic. Better get rid of the beautiful Helen, because she's a danger to our children. But and to themselves. What is this saying? It's a way of policing desire. It's a way of reminding, I suppose arguably it's a way for the audiences of these stories to remind themselves, or to trick themselves into believing that there's something dangerous about falling in love with women, or certain kind of voluptuous or desirous women. We'll come back to this theme in just 2 seconds. But the agony is interesting. This idea of being afflicted. You see someone who's beautiful and you feel, this agony. So all these people see Helen of Troy and they think, and they're consumed by something dangerous, like toxic, like a poison, is how they describe it. It's quite interesting that all of this can now be explained in the most boring way by this kind of stuff. So this connection between love and pain, which has been romantic and wonderful in the Western tradition, and I think it's really essential, by the way, as well, because I think an idea of love without pain, what does it look like? It's not real, is it? I mean, it's fragile. If you imagine love without pain, well, it's not realistic. It's not really accommodating another, is it? If you fall in love, you're going to get hurt at some point by your loved person. You can't say, well, it's not love then. Real love is painless. I think that's kind of stupid. like saying eating has no digestion involved, or, warfare involves no blood. Love involves pain. But this map shows it like, in the most, or this image shows it in the most ludicrous way. All right, so apparently love and pain are both in the anterior cingulate cortex. Such a shame Krishna's not here, although I thought you might correct this. Love and pain activate the same area in the brain. Okay, so when you're in, that hurt really badly, if you shut your hand in the door, apparently that moment when you fall in love, and we're talking really about limerence or lust or desire, that sort of set your heart racing feeling, when you fall for someone. This has been described in the literature. You get really hot, you turn pale, your heart races, your appetite fails, all these things. So apparently it's the same part of the brain as pain. Did I describe that right, guys? Does that sound familiar? Apparently this is, now we can explain it with phenylethylamine. Okay, nausea, loss of appetite. Oh, yes, that's why you feel nausea and loss of appetite, because when you fall in love, it produces this substance in the body, phenylethylamine, which causes you this nausea and loss of appetite. It's kind of banal, isn't it? And apparently dopamine, you get lots of dopamine when you have this hot, pale, trembling experience of falling for someone. Dopamine leads to obsessive thoughts. Obsessive thoughts. I've got to call them. I'll call them tomorrow. No, I won't. I can't do that. It's stupid. No, I will call them. These things. It's dopamine. It's just the dopamine. It's not you. It's not some spell of a god. It's the dopamine. Apparently, guys, there is a difference between lust and love in the chemistry here. Apparently, all of these things burn away. I can believe it. These things burn away after a while in love. And then oxytocin takes over. This kind of attachment hormone, it's related more with a more durable pleasure. Hugging, comfort, attachment, empathy, human warmth, all those things. This is oxytocin, apparently. So lust and love, we can tell. We just need to take a sample of someone's chemical makeup and we'll find out whether you're in lust or love. If only it were that simple. Okay, I hope you're following me, Zoomers. Do you have any questions? Can you even hear me? But do you have any questions? Or you guys, do you have any questions? I'm not the total love expert. I can't solve all your love problems. Okay, all right, temptation then. Let's get into some of the moralizing. Eve, this is the serpent in the Garden of Eden. This is a wonderful imagination of it from an artwork from the 1470s. I'm sure you know that there are only two types of women in the Middle Ages. Only two types of women. You're either Mary, a virgin, the exemplar mother of God, totally pure, wonderful in all ways, or you're Eve, a temptress, a devil in disguise. This is kind of, now you have to remember that this is how people who've decided to renounce sex and love for their entire lives and live in a monastery, imagine it. A lot of these guys never actually met women properly, only they answered the door to them once or twice and got a bit embarrassed. A lot of these guys are writing the text that then characterize women in these ways. But these are like two exemplars, which obviously we find deeply misogynistic, deeply troubling to us. Nevertheless, they're there, and they're used in medieval poetry. Oh, she's an Eve, she's a temptress. So it goes back to the Garden of Eden, of course, and Eve as tempter. And of course, it's a fruit. It's actually gluttony that she tempts Adam with, right? Eat this. Or maybe pride, take this and we'll be more knowledgeable than anything. We'll be as knowledgeable as God. But this is taken as an exemplar of lust in the Middle Ages. It's not obvious, though, that this was going to happen. There's nothing in Christianity, in the Bible, in the New Testament, that makes it clear that this is what it's going to look like. Women are the devil. This is actually grown by certain, usually, all of them male, all of them quite cloistered thinkers. Tertullian, one of the early Christian fathers, is one of them. He writes, among other things, a tract on women's clothing. And he writes this, and this is where it kind of begins. This is the thread of a deep, deep misogyny that sees women as temptresses, that men have to hide themselves away from in order to stay pure. Here's Tertullian then, in that treatise on women's clothes. You are the devil's gateway. He's talking about all women here. So this is all of us, well, all of us except me. You are the devil's gateway. You are the unsealer of that forbidden tree. You are the first deserter of the divine law. You are she who persuaded him who the devil was not valiant enough to attack. You destroyed so easily God's image. Man, on account of your desert, or is it desert? That is death. Even the Son of God had to die. And do you think about adorning yourself over and above your tunics of skins? Okay, God, there's a lot in there. There's a lot in there. This is strong. What I would say is this is 200 CE. You don't really get much like that before this. He's one of the first inventors of this tradition. Look at the accusations here. They're pretty strong, aren't they? The devil's gateway. The unsealer of the forbidden tree. You can see the Eve element there, obviously. The first deserter of the divine law. Okay, so it's more than just temptation. It's opening up men to, good men apparently, to the devil. So you see there's a lot of blame here, isn't there? It's not men's fault. Just like with Helen of Troy, all those soldiers. It wasn't their fault, it's Helen that they blame. Here it's Eve that they blame. And womankind more generally. And deserters of the divine law. Augustine is obviously another one of these figures who has these fixations. I think generally if you ask any historian to say where does the really negative view of sex come from in the Western tradition, we typically see it as Augustine. And this is very personal for Augustine. It's very, very personal because he writes the autobiography, the Confessions, which you've all read, Zoomers, in great books. And of course in the Confessions, right, it's about his own struggles with his own temptations. And he makes lust really central, really slap bang in the middle of his conversion, right, is lust. And how how he's glad that he's escaped it. Famously in his early life, he said, God, I'm sure you know this quote. If you only know one Augustine quote, it's a good one to know. God, make me chaste, but not yet. This was Augustine's classic. He wanted to, not have lusty desires, not to ever have sex again, but not yet. Do it later. This is how he describes his youth, his adolescence. I intend to remind myself of my past foulness and carnal corruptions. I ran wild in the shadowy jungle of erotic adventures. The single desire that dominated my search for delight was simply to love and to be loved. There's a lot here. First, I would say Augustine adds this heavy overtone of what I would call filth, basically, that lust is somehow dirty, right? The idea that we use the word dirty to describe, erotic literature comes back to this kind of language here. My past foulness, ran wild in the shadowy jungle. That association between lust and something base and earthy, that's very Augustine. And also, look, isn't this crazy? The only desire he had was simply to love and be loved. What could be more honest than that? That might be the first line of your college application form, I just want to love and be loved. It's reasonable, isn't it? I would let that person in. That's nice. In other words, it's wholesome. Augustine is describing something that we think of as quite wholesome. Your dating profile. I just want to love and be loved. We would say this is the loveliest dating profile there is. Good on that person. Here Augustine is saying that is the filth in the grounds. That is the dirtiest thing he can imagine. So you can see the Western tradition had a lot to fight against to bring lust out of this association. If even to want to be loved and be loved is considered somehow evil for Augustine. On the theme of temptation, then, let's go to Aquinas. He's a man who I don't think was ever actually tempted. I would just say that. I think if there was ever a pure heart, it's Thomas. I think there is a famous story where one of his enemies or his family's enemies brought all of these women to Thomas Aquinas' study to try and tempt him. And he just didn't look up from writing, and then they did a striptease and he didn't look up. Thomas could not be tempted. But he had a program, apparently. He had an idea of how not to be tempted. He had a method to avoid temptation, which we can go through in just a second. Not that anyone needs it. Just one quote from him first. The vice against nature, which attaches to every venereal act from which generation cannot follow. So to be clear, for Aquinas, what are you escaping? What kind of temptation should you run away from? Specifically, it's the stuff against nature, which is anything that's not going to be marital sex, in other words. So, this is, and it's amazing Aquinas even accepted that, but there you go. All right, so how escaping lust, his 4 methods, 4 tried and tested methods. By the way, in research for this, I looked at all of these blogs, and there are Christian writers now who kind of, they use this as good advice for people. It's, it still works, in other words. It's quite interesting and quite touching to read that. All right, so Thomas's 4 guidelines: avoid, shut out, pray, and distract. We can go through them one by one. First, avoid. Turn away your face from a woman dressed up, and do not gaze upon another's beauty. Again, it's kind of blaming the women, isn't it? But there you go. That's rule number 1 for Thomas Aquinas. Just turn away. Just avoid. Don't go to places where there might be women that you might fall in love with. Just don't look at other people. Preferably, this mask, put it over your eyes. That's the best place for it, for Thomas Aquinas. Shut out. Number 2, shut out. Easy, all right? Actually, not so easy. I chastise my body and bring it into subjection. Okay, so, maybe run 15 kilometers on the treadmill, then show your body who's boss. I think this is the Aquinas idea. You fight your body, mortify the flesh. Okay, so he says, don't eat for a while. That'll show your body. Apparently, not eating will help you quell your desire. Shut it out. Next, pray. He describes this as like a battle. He says, imagine, you are in the ring with lust, all right? There's the temptation of lust and there's you. You need all the help you can get. He says, this is not a battle you're going to win. It's not easy to win this. It really is difficult. Aquinas admits, even if he was brilliant at avoiding lust, he says it's really difficult to avoid it. So he says, just like in a battle, right, you would want some help, or you would want people to cheer on. So let's say it's God and lust fighting in this fight. You would be cheering on God. Come on, God, you can win. You can beat lust. And he says that's what praying is like. You pray for some help in your corner. I need help. Maybe my friend can throw me a weapon to help me beat lust, but you can't do it alone. And so it's getting help. That's the praying part. And then finally, distract. It's the easiest one. Keep yourself busy with some wholesome occupations. Idleness has taught much evil. Okay, so it should be simple, right? So just do those 4 things, no lust, or you'll avoid it for Thomas, and distraction is quite easy. Now, with all of that, it makes me kind of depressed at some deep level, and I thought we would have Oscar Wilde as an antidote. The only way to get rid of a temptation is to yield to it. Resist it and your soul grows sick with longing for the things it has forbidden itself. Obviously, we love Oscar Wilde for these kind of quotes. But there's a serious point there. So it's one thing to avoid lust, but doesn't that make it seem like, you're just you're just dodging a problem? You're just shutting something out? Are you really, are you going to, if you follow Thomas Aquinas' rules, you just have to resist temptation, ignore it, and then you'll be okay. Shouldn't there be some problem that you address within yourself? Maybe this doesn't seem necessary if we're talking about, a wholesome kind of desire. But if you're talking about a dangerous kind of lust, or what some might consider morally dangerous, like adulterous lust, right? You're in a happy, loving relationship, and then, lust strikes. The idea is, Thomas Aquinas is saying, just avoid it, distract yourself. And it's well, maybe that's not the real problem. Maybe you need to address the reasons why you're having a wandering eye in the first place. At least Oscar Wilde gives us a vocabulary for doing that, Resist it and your soul grows sick with longing for the things it has forbidden itself. Oscar would tell us, give in to the temptation, then you might not be tempted anymore, then you might get back to your real life. I thought for a bit of fun, we would ask a practical question. Well, not really a bit of fun, actually. It's not going to be fun. But were medieval people tempted? How did it look? What was real life like? We talk about all of this kind of abstractions about moral guidelines, Thomas Aquinas telling people to avoid lust. But let's just have a practical example for a second. Let's go to the Middle Ages. Let's go to this poor guy, Arnaud de Verneuil. He was arrested on the 23rd of June, 1323. He was arrested for heresy, actually, because he had some beliefs that were unorthodox. He believed in things, we won't go into it, but he was a heretic, right? He believed, God didn't make the world, it was the devil, all these kinds of things. But he's also arrested for sodomy, for sodomitic practices, which I'm not sure what this means, right? No one knows what this means at some level, because it reduced down sodomy. I mean, we have a meaning of sodomy now, but in the Middle Ages, sodomy just means any non-procreative sexual act. Anything that doesn't produce children, it can be sodomy. And actually, they love classifying all the different kinds of sodomy, and we'll see that in a second. But this is the kind of temptation that we see in practice. This guy, Arnaud de Verneuil, I think he was a priest, right? And so he would take, he had a lot of people come to visit him, confession, things like that. And he used to bring, young men home, and they'd discuss the Word of God in a bit more detail. And he used to say to them things like this: if we had a woman here, what would you do? That's his tester question. He sees how they respond to that. And then his next question is, do you know what some men do with each other like that? And so this is his kind of tempting two-step chat-up line. It's not, in a way, look, the thing that comforts me about this is it doesn't look that different from, I'm sure, the kinds of things that happen. I know, I don't want to make any judgments. Things like this have been happening all the time. It comforts us, right, that there are moral codes, but it's not like everyone's brainwashed. Desire is still desire. People do things against their better judgment and also for fun and pleasure, just the same way that they do now in the Middle Ages. Whatever. We might moralise this very differently. We might now moralise this as very wrong because he's in a position of authority and he's seducing someone who kind of trusts him. That's how we would moralise this, I think, as some kind of unacceptable lust. But in this particular period, right, the problem here is actually very, very technical. What did they then do? And I mean as graphically as we can imagine, what exactly did they do? They wanted to know in detail. I don't think if we had this interview now, I think like if this was a disciplinary hearing at a university, any kind of sexual activity, okay, we don't want to hear any more. We don't need to know everything, all the ins and outs. Thank you very much, but it's already inappropriate. But this was an inquisition, and they wanted to know everything that he tempted this young man to do. And this is where we get down to classification and some crucial aspect of what is. Well, let's go on to the issue of sodomy and sexuality. What are these practices, these unacceptable sexual practices that we moralise as wrong in this period, or that people moralise as wrong? So there's Peter Damien. I promised you him a few weeks ago. His Book of Gomorrah, and he's talking about sodomy now, and we're not clear what this means, right? We assume it does not necessarily mean same-sex activity. It means anything non-procreative, or as he calls it, against nature. 4 types of this form of criminal wickedness can be distinguished. Okay, and he says, the devil's artful fraud devises these degrees of falling into ruin, such that the higher the level the unfortunate soul reaches in them, the deeper it sinks in the depths of the hell's pit. Okay, I'm going to say something important about that quote. Some horrible words are coming on the screen now. But he describes these 4 levels, and it's interesting, right? So there are 4 levels of bad. There are progressively worse things you can do in sodomy. Okay, so it's not just, and that's important, it's not just the temptation here of some sort of sexual activity with maybe someone of the same sex or someone that you're not in love with, or adultery. It's not the conscious mind making that choice that's the problem for him. It's how far you actually go with the body. So here we go. Sorry about these words. So there is sin. Okay, so on the first level of this is sin with themselves alone. You can use your own imagination what that means. The second is mutual masturbation. You can use your imagination again. Thirdly, femoral fornication. What is this? I'll explain. And then finally, the complete act against nature itself. Peter Damien doesn't give us the graphic terms he means at the end there. The complete act against nature. But femoral fornication, this is what Arnaud, that man who was arrested, tempting the younger man, was discovered that this is what their Inquisition discovered that he'd done. This femoral means between the thighs, basically, between the thighs, or some sort of leg. Right, so, and then the complete act against nature, we're to assume means oh goodness, you can use your imagination. You can use your imagination again. Why am I going through all of this in painful detail? It's obviously painful for me at some level. Why am I going through this in painful detail? It mattered. It apparently mattered deeply what happened in this situation, because it was considered less grave. So for example, 2 men to have sexual intercourse, but for it only to be between the thighs is not so bad as whatever this complete act against nature is. And mutual masturbation again is, and this is like an opening up of, it's not quite so bad. We won't press full charges, but it's a concern with it. And the reason I pay so much attention is, notice, this is an act that's being focused on, the act of criminal wickedness and the act of the devil's fraud. Because as Foucault reminds us in the history of sexuality, The concern with sodomy was about acts itself, all right? It was not about identities. The homosexual was now a species, all right? So Foucault reminds us that there is an identity of homosexuality which comes much later, all right, in history, which is almost a 19th century invention. What does this mean? It means that you are defined by your sexual orientation, your sexuality. In the Middle Ages, as we saw, these temptations, these urges, they're not defined by them. It's not like this person is a sodomite. This person has committed an act of wickedness. And the distinction between the two is quite important. It means that we're not dealing with essentializing a person. We're dealing with like a tempting act of wickedness. I hope that makes sense. Zoomers, do you have any questions? I know you have questions. Anastasia, yeah. Oh, I'll get you the microphone. Here we go. It does work. It just doesn't sound like it does.
Okay. So my question is actually about this, the fact that you distinguish the love and the lust. But nowadays there is another also important kind of term. It's about not only nowadays, but in general, reproductive instinct. Because I'm just looking at this phenomenon more from my deterministic point of view. And I also remember this book of Franz de Waal about kind of morality sources between apes, eman, I mean, apes, something like, in Russian is istoki morali. I don't know how it sounds in English. So, and even among this kind of ape men, yeah, primates, this is the right word, yeah, there are already some rules that don't let them do something that we will define as lust, but more do something that we would define as love. And I just wonder, what is your opinion about this third kind of perspective?
Yeah, reproductive. That's a really good question, isn't it? Well, I think there's an acknowledgement here, and it's really important. There's an acknowledgement among all of these theologians and philosophers in the Middle Ages that, yeah, reproductive instinct is there. It's a natural instinct. They're not trying to say that all lust is temptation, is, you know, from a demon or something like that. There's a strong acknowledgement, as we'll see in a second, that this emerges naturally in the body and that it is ultimately consummated in procreation. The difference is that they'll say, the difference is, and this is where it gets a bit weird, if you like, it can be consummated in procreation, but it can also be consummated in something else, which is in other forms of creative work. So we think about Plato, and we'll talk about him in a second. That natural procreative spark does not have to go towards making children. It can go towards making philosophy or poetry or art. And that's quite an interesting distinction. I think Thomas Aquinas talks about the manner. So again, it's a sin when what you're trying to do is not the procreative act. Again, that acknowledges that there's a source of things which is quite naturalized. I hope that makes sense. What we don't have are reductions of all sexual desire to procreation, actually. That's what's interesting. No one says it's only about making children. Far from it. They also acknowledge this higher element. Love is something divine. Love is something that can lead us to higher things. That remains in the philosophy. No philosopher in the Middle Ages says love is just about making children. Or no philosopher says it's just about a family unit and keeping it together. And that's, you know, in many ways uplifting. Sex is not reduced to reproduction. But they still acknowledge that that's a component. Any questions from Zoom?
Yeah, I do have a question.
Okay.
That's about women being devil's gateway.
Yes.
And what did women philosophers thought about all this? Women philosophers like Hildegard and the others, what did they write about all this stuff?
Well, you know that I'm going to have the caveat, Anne, that we don't have enough writings by women philosophers. This is a problem. But the ones that do have an interesting perspective. And the question there is how much we take them seriously, in the sense that are they are they actually just participating in a male discourse, writing what they think the men want to hear, if you like? But Eloise, you remember Eloise, the lover of Abelard, one of the great minds of the 12th century, right? She knew Greek and Hebrew when no men knew Greek and Hebrew in the 12th century, and only in her 20s. She said, oh, how unfortunate for me to have been born a woman, to have been born a temptress. This is her description of it. So look, it's unfortunate, but what we do see is that the women who do write about this echo and reiterate this, if you like, misogynist view of women as tempter. It's a game that they all participate in. I'm sure there are texts that take things very differently. And I think we could look at the work of Caroline Walker Bynum, Jesus as Mother, which is just a terrific book. And I'm sure that there's stuff in there that would give us a different view. But yeah, I'm sorry. I'm sorry to give you a disappointing answer. We will see one exceptional woman, an exceptional writer in a minute, and her particular take on this. So I think we should move to lack. It's a good place to go. Lack. Ask yourselves, all right, is it, you know, to fall in love, to fall into desire, they call it limerence, by the way, this stage where you're not sure what it is. Is it lust, is it love, just the heart racing and all that? Limerence is one way of describing that. Is it because of lack? Do you fall in love because you lack something and the other completes you? Or is it something else? We're back to Stendhal and his crystallization. Is it something extra that you want? Luxuria, of course, in Latin means excess as well, or it signifies excess. Do you want something extra, or are you looking for something that you lack? You remember the Symposium, you remember Plato, and you remember Aristophanes' speech. We were just talking last night about great books and, you know, does it keep coming up? Well, this is the second great book we can talk about in the same lecture. You remember Aristophanes' speech, and it's a jokey idea that humans used to be this composite entity of two beings together, and that then Zeus decided to rip them apart. Why? So that there'd be more humans to make sacrifices and so on, and to make them less powerful, apparently. This is a joke, right, of Aristophanes'. But it's important because it's the myth that the human lacks something. So all of love for Aristophanes is searching for the other half that you used to be, your other composite being. So it can be quite a beautiful idea. But it's also kind of weird because this is what you want to be. You want to look like this again. It's kind of a little bit disturbing to us. But you remember in the Symposium, Socrates then took that idea and made it more beautiful, really. I mean, Aristophanes gave the jokey version. Socrates gave the profound version, which said, yes, love is predicated on lack. You do lack something. And you lack sort of truth and beauty. Your soul is incomplete and you long to be united in truth and beauty, and so love strives you forward. And for Socrates, of course, you know, you can get some glimpse of that with another person, but it can only be really consummated in this kind of epiphanic moment of union with truth and beauty. You might remember that from great books. So this theory is always there, lack. Of course, it gets Christianized. Now, the interesting thing about its Christianization is what role does lust play, desire, that initial spark of feeling something? What does it play in this journey to, well, basically, for the Christians, they make it God. So you'll see with some writers, and we're going to go to 3 unrequited lovers now. For 2 of these writers, right, the ultimate endpoint of their lust and their desire is God. Yes, that is Bernard of Clairvaux in the middle taking the Virgin Mary's breast milk. That is exactly what's happening. You know, it is. I'm afraid that is the theory of Bernard. Okay, so 3 unrequited lovers and their journey to God through love or through lust. Here they are. So we have Arnaud Daniel, a troubadour. Dante called him one of the great poets. Actually, Ezra Pound called him the greatest poet who ever lived. I always think it's sad for these guys that they were the greatest poets, the greatest romantic poets, maybe who ever lived, and the only images we have of them are these kind of awkward, you know, awkward medieval illustrations. Doesn't do him justice. In the middle, we've got Bernard of Clairvaux, who the students are definitely familiar with by now. The greatest philosopher of love in the Middle Ages, definitely. And then finally, Hadewig of Brabant. That's a wonderful image, isn't it? Hadewig is my favourite love poet, and we are going to be reading some Hadewig in our class on Thursday. Okay, these 3 are all unrequited lovers. That is, the object of their desire they do not have. in different ways, right? For Hadwick, it is Jesus that she's in love with, most intensely. Jesus himself as person, Jesus as man, the dead Jesus, the dead and resurrected, and in the cosmos, Jesus. For Bernard of Clairvaux, well, it's not the Virgin Mary, but it's God, more abstractly. That abstract desire to be reunited with God. As Bernard of Clairvaux said, love of God is the only kind of love that can be quenched. It's the only kind of love that can be satisfied. And he describes his whole life as a journey to fulfill and consummate that love for God. And then Arno Daniel, more relatable to us, he writes about different women that he loves. And it's always the same story. I love her, but I can't tell her. I love her, but I'll never be with her. But it's beautiful. You must read some Arno Daniel. All right, so the quiz. I have a quiz. Which of these three is the following quote from? Is this a quotation talking about Jesus as human body? Is it talking about God as abstract entity, Bernard of Clairvaux? Or is it talking about as a physical woman that Arno Daniel has seen but cannot love or cannot have or whatever? Okay, so here's the quote. I know you're going to get this, students. I know you're going to get it. I'm going to read you the quote because it's such an exquisite one. And my heart and my veins and all my limbs trembled and shuddered with desire. And I was in such a state as I had been so many times before, so passionate and so terribly unnerved that I thought I should not satisfy my lover and my lover not fully gratify me. Then I would have to desire while dying and die while desiring. At that time, I was so terribly unnerved with passionate love and in such pain that I imagined all my limbs breaking one by one, and all my veins were separately in torturous pain. Okay, that's the quiz, guys. Which of the lovers, which of our unrequited lovers is this, and who are they writing about?
Is it like one?
The first one.
It's one of the three. Yes, it's one.
The first one.
So, Arno Daniel, loves a woman. It's not Arno Daniel. Arno Daniel writes beautiful poetry, but this is not him. This is not a poem about a woman. This is either a poem about the abstract God or a poem about the human, physical Jesus. You can, by now, we can just skip, I suppose, to who it is. These are the words of Hadwick of Brabant, writing about Jesus. She describes how she wants his body to press into her body. She wants to feel his body. It is exquisite. It's erotic. What is this feeling that he describes, or she describes? Well, I'm not suggesting that it's necessarily the same as the lust that we described earlier, but it does seem like we've got the phenylethylamine, we've got the endorphins, the dopamine. It does seem like that anterior cingulate is pulsing. It does seem like it's the same desire she's describing as lust, but she feels it for Jesus. We'll read that whole vision. That's her vision number 7. We'll read that on Thursday in context. But that's Hadwick. She is part of a wonderful movement in women's writing and women's poetry. She's not a nun. That's an important thing to note. It used to be thought, she must be a nun because she wrote things. She must have been in a convent to learn. She did not. She's one of these things we call beguines. She is a beguine. She is a probably aristocratic woman who has the access to, writing materials, which are very expensive. But she goes there on weekends to a beguinage to be with other women, to discuss God, to discuss ideas, to discuss philosophy, to write poetry. It's a beautiful, beautiful world for Hadwick of Brabant, but it's one that is shot through with torture, her desire for the physical being of Christ. It is physical. The game's kind of over now, but there is a second quote. Which one is this? I only know the grief that comes to me, to my love-ridden heart, out of ever loving, since my will is so firm and whole that it never parted or grew distant from her whom I craved at first sight and afterwards. And now in her absence I tell her burning words. Then when I see her, I don't know so much I have to what to say. This is quite obviously, we're talking about her. This is not Bernard of Clairvaux talking about God. This is Arno Daniel. But you see, it's not even as extreme, is it, as Hadwick of Brabant? But you see again the grief that comes to me, to my love-ridden heart. Now, the slightly disturbing question is, Hadwick, when she writes about Jesus, she uses the metaphor of, if you like, Is it a metaphor? The physicality is there. It seems like she's expressing something so pure, her desire to be, what Socrates might have called in touch with truth and beauty, but it has a physical dimension, inseparably physical. When Arno Daniel writes about his lover, is he also writing about that truth and beauty that Socrates talks about? So in other words, in his desire, which we could call lust, we could call love, we don't know, is he also writing about some other desire for God, desire for truth, desire for beauty? We do see this in a lot of poets in this period. They write about God, but they write about women, but they're really writing about God. Like, you are just a transparent window through whom I see God, which is, as I said earlier in an earlier lecture, is really depressing. No one wants to have a love poem written to you like that. But anyway, you see the language is similar. It's the making divine, if you like. It's the making divine of sexual attraction that we're seeing here, making it into something exquisite and higher. Arno Daniel, by the way, is in Dante's Purgatorio 26. That's actually pretty much as high as any of us could ever get. Like, to be on the terrace of lust in purgatory. Like, that's what we're all praying where we end up. If we were all Catholics, we'd all pray. It's the last place you have to go. Look, you see this in this image. It's the last thing you do. A little bit of fire, sure, it will hurt. But it's the last thing you do before, look, the Garden of Eden. The very last thing before your earthly salvation. Arno Daniel is in there for Dante in Purgatorio 26, precisely because Dante believed that Arno's love poetry was more than just about women. It was about truth and beauty, and ultimately about, as Dante called love, the force that moves all the universe and all the stars. That's what he thought Arno was writing about. And of course, Bernard, there he is with the breast milk. We've talked about Bernard too many times. I don't need to talk about him again. I would note that he does have 4 levels of loving. You love yourself for your own sake, and then you love God for your own sake, and then you love God for God's sake, and finally, you love yourself for God's sake. I'm not going to go into those, but he does describe this journey. And we described this earlier on in the lecture series of true love is like a droplet of water dissolving. Like, if you drop a droplet of water into a bottle of wine, it becomes part of the wine, right? It's indistinguishable. It's lost. It's become one with something. For Bernard, that's what loving God is like. When you truly love God, you become one with God. And you are no longer you are part of God. Just like you're a droplet of water that falls into the bottle of wine that is God. And you're now part of a higher, I think we'll all agree, a better substance. Wine, but being better than water. But the purer, better substance. But just one line of Bernard's love poetry. When will my soul, inebriated with divine love, learn to be unconsciously self-forgetful and simply be a broken vessel? Look, they're all capable of writing exquisitely. You can't really tell. Are they writing about a real person? Are they writing about God? Is it lust? Is it love? Is it desire? What is it? I could challenge you. I could give you 100 different poems and you wouldn't know. I don't think I wouldn't know. They look the same. And all of that reminds me of Alain Badiou. If we're going to have a modern theorist of love, this is the guy who says that love is like an event where you get smashed apart and re-put back together. It's at the point of desire that love fractures the one in order that the two occur in supposition. For Bernard and for all these love poets, it's that joining together, becoming more than yourself. You have to annihilate yourself in love. Angela Foligno, who I mentioned many lectures ago, was so in love with God that she took a flame and set fire to her genitals. She set fire to her genitals because she was so in love with God. Now, what does any of it mean? Love as self-annihilating. In your love, you no longer are yourself. You want to remake yourself to be part of the other. Now, for these Christians, believing that God is out there, you can understand how that has almost a suicidal impulse. I want to be destroyed and be nothing so I can be with God. For lovers, it's a little bit different, but we can see for Badiou, bringing us back down to earth, that it's a similar idea that he explores, self-annihilation in becoming one with another. Badiou will make that a theory of love that we can apply in that one, but we can imagine in our own lives, maybe more easily than we can imagine putting a torch or a flame anywhere near our private paths. Right, okay, so let's move on. All right, so it's just fun from here on out. No more theology. let's just look at some more down-to-earth stuff. Any questions from the Zoomers?
Yeah, I actually do have a question.
Okay.
So it's about aromantism. I kind of wonder what medieval people would think about a romantic person, because they claim that they do not feel romantic attraction, but at the same time they can feel sexual arousal.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So aromantic is the question. People who... So this is a modern category, of course. The contemporary category that we have of aromantic, which is an individual who may feel sexual attraction but does not have a romantic attraction to other people. Is that correct?
Yeah, it is.
Okay.
They kind of say that they feel toward romantic attraction the same way as a sexual will feel towards sexual intercourse.
Well, look, on the one hand, there would be a concept of this in friendship as something divine. Philia would be like the Greek word, wouldn't it, for love of this kind. So friendship that is holy and wonderful, but is not sexual. Right, I see, so that would be the opposite. That would be asexual, wouldn't it? That would be romantic asexual. Aromantic, I don't see it because sex is always imagined as part of a romanticized view of things in this period. I may be wrong. I think we probably need to dig down and find a medieval theology of aromanticism, but I haven't found one. So that is, I think that it would be termed as sinful. It would be morally coded as wrong in the Middle Ages, because sex without romance would be seen as even worse. Okay, because it would be seen as something purely physical. But I don't know. That might not be satisfying. But that would be the moral code. I think it would be seen as I think it would be seen as an aberration. But look, they are medieval writers. They do not operate with the same phenomena as we do, or the same terminology. Okay, let's move on to anxiety. And I think, Alina, I'm probably right that some people have anxieties about precisely these sexual categories, like asexuality, aromanticism, bisexuality, and so on. There are all kinds of anxieties that we have. Let's look at some medieval anxieties. I'm going to start with this because this is just wonderful. This was actually discovered really recently. That was, why is it that shape? Anyone know? This was a fragment of a manuscript that was just discovered. And it's about this poem, right? The Rose and Dawn, the Rose Thorn. And we knew about this poem, but we thought it dated from much later, like 150 years later. And it was part of this theory. Ah, yes, all this deeply sexualized poetry, that's a later thing of this kind. But then they discovered this and they see, oh, it's actually from 1300. Why is it that shape? Anyone know? This is like one of these wonderful phenomena. It was a bookbinding. So it had been in a library for 700 years, but somebody once cut it up and used it to help glue a book together. So it's only when they tried to repair this book that they discovered it. And it's just a nice example of how some things get discovered in medieval life. Right, this story is pretty shocking. It's a story of a woman, and she's in dialogue with, I'm sorry guys, she's in dialogue with her own vagina. Okay, her vagina talks. I don't know whether it was a magic spell, I don't know what happens, but her vagina has a mind of its own, and it talks to her. And it says this to her, it says, I think it's too much that you're thriving and yet I'm not allowed a share, especially considering that men everywhere adore you only because of me. And if you were to lose me, every single one of them would find you completely worthless. So, and the woman says, this is ridiculous, look, I don't need you anyway, I'm beautiful without. I'm sorry guys, this is obviously a deeply problematic and anxiety-inducing text. What happens is the vagina, or the vulva, escapes and goes off, gets mistaken for a frog, almost gets eaten. I'm sorry, this is the story. And this woman then men fall in love with her, but then they reject her when they discover that she has no sex organs. And so the moral of the story is, it's actually a horrible ending where a man discovers the vagina and says, "Is this yours? Let me give it back to you." You can imagine how it ends. You can imagine how it ends. He gives it back to her. So it's this, but the anxieties are loads. There are loads of anxieties in this kind of story. Number one, why does the vagina leave? Why does the vagina talk? Well, actually, there are all of these medical texts which describe the possibility of a migrating womb, that the womb will migrate around the body of certain women in hysterical situations, that their womb will leave, and that a doctor needs to attract it back to the right space in the body using lavender. This is all true. It's really bizarre. So there are anxieties. What does any of it mean? Well, obviously, look, this plays on precisely the kind of anxieties that actually you mentioned, Alina, like what is it to have sexualized desire separate from romantic desire? Well, this story shows that the two seem to be symbiotic, right, in this imagination. That the man can't imagine loving this woman without her sex organ. But obviously, it's a playful story too. It's kind of horrifying too. I thought I'd put it out there. In medieval stories, there are all kinds of images of migrating sex organs, of talking sex organs that have minds of their own. So on the one hand, that's one anxiety that I just like to put out there. How do we cope with it? How do we deal with it? Well, in our class on Thursday, you'll be reading another one a bit like that. Another is the anxiety about what women get up to behind closed doors. And this myth of Melusine is another one. And so these we could have fitted in with the sort of evil temptress model of women's sexuality. And I don't know whether we could just see it as part of a myth-making process where, beware of women because secretly underneath they are dragons or whatever. But basically the myth of Melusine is one of these. She's supposed to be like the founding mother of a French aristocratic house. And the story is that she's secretly, every Saturday she has a bath. And when she has her bath, she becomes a mermaid dragon thing with wings and a long tail, and it's all fine. And then one day the husband sees her through the door because he breaks the code. He's supposed to know that this is her private bath time, that she can't be seen on Saturdays at bath time. But then he sees her, so he breaks the code. He breaks her trust, and then it's shame and scandal. And she's ejected from her household and so on. So this is another way that this anxiety is there. And now you can see it as a sexual anxiety. You can imagine this story being told and I can imagine certain repressive kind of fathers telling this story to their sons, I don't really, I say I can imagine it, I can't actually imagine how this is supposed to work. That's why this section is also about my anxieties about this material. What does any of it mean? Here you can see more images of Melusine. By the way, she had all these children with this guy, despite this secret Saturday thing. And look, here she is breastfeeding, which is amazing. And there she is again in the same situation. So look, her children don't seem to mind. They're happy with it. But there you go. So these are some of the anxieties. I could have produced loads more. What do any of them mean? It's up to you, students, as interpreters of medieval texts. I'm still waiting for really good explanations of some of this material. Some of it I think we can code quite easily within a misogynistic tradition, which is anxious of feminine sexuality. But some of it is just odd. And some of it I wonder if we just need to encode with the word play. Play. What is it to playfully imagine sexual practices? And this is where we have to turn the torch back on ourselves and say, are we the ones who are anxious? Are we the ones who have problems with sex? Are we the ones who can't cope with it in our daily lives? There is a thesis, and of course, Foucault's History of Sexuality would be the place to go, that, the repressive hypothesis, that it suits us to imagine that people were more repressive in the past about sex, and that we are more liberated. That suits us. Of course, the story could well be the opposite, right? And so with that in mind, I'm going to show you this next image, which is not nice, okay, if you don't mind. But is it us who have the anxiety about it, or did they have anxieties about sexuality? This is an image of So I should explain what this item is. This is a pilgrimage badge, okay? So we found these, I didn't find them. People found these at the bottoms of riverbeds, like in places like Bruges. I think this one actually was from Bruges. It was made of pewter originally. This is a copy, I think, which has been shined up. But these are pilgrimage badges. So you go on a pilgrimage to a holy site, say like the site where a saint died, or a shrine, and then afterwards you pay a few pennies and you get given one of these badges. And it might be all kinds of different images, but this is one of them. And the great thing is, right, this is all we know about this badge. I mean, there are a few commentaries here and there, but more or less that's all we know. Who bought them? Well, obviously enough people that we can find a few in the riverbed. Were they expensive? They don't seem to have been expensive. Were they mass-produced? Yes, we can tell that. So they wore these. So what does it mean? So you can see this thing. This is a parody of an Easter procession, I think. So at Easter, they walk around with the wafer, which is God's body, right? Christ's body, which is the bread. You know, in the communion, take my body, this is the bread, take my blood, that's the wine. And they carry the host, they call it the host. At Easter, it's carried on a thing like this. So instead of that, we see here, you know, this is the vulva, for some reason, with a crown. And here we have it is three penises. That is definitely what it is, with legs, carrying it. So you got this on pilgrimage. What does it mean? Can anyone, I don't know if anyone on Zoom wants to offer a meaning for this thing. I certainly can't offer a meaning. But there are several things we could say that it's okay to use sexual imagery. Sexual imagery and Christian imagery, there's not such a big problem. The two can go together quite well. It's okay to have something that we might consider obscene that you wear in public. Is it okay to joke about it? Is it okay to blur the world of, you know, the most sacred ceremony and the world of, you know, what we would call pornography? I don't know. It's a mystery. I'll leave it there. But I'm just going to tell two quick stories that we can imagine playing with this concept. And these are Fablio. You're going to read one, St. Martin's 4 Wishes, on Thursday. This will be the last thing in the lecture. The ring that controlled erections. This is another one of those playful stories. And it's quite a simple story. And there's a stream, there's a river, and this guy has a ring. And the ring is like Viagra. It allows him to perform sexually, shall we say. And he drops the ring. And then a bishop finds the ring and puts it on. So this is a nice ring, I'll take that ring. And puts it on, and he keeps getting erections. Hazo has yet another thing to tell. A man once owned a ring which, when worn by a magic spell, at once would make his manhood swell. Okay, so this is the story, and it plays on this lovely idea of a bishop who can't control his manhood. What does it mean again? It's a wonderful story, and maybe it's and of course at the end, like the guy says, "Oh, I can solve your sexual problem. Just give me 2 of your rings and some money, and the problem will be solved." And of course, he gives him the ring back. The guy who needs the ring gets it back. The bishop is thrilled that he doesn't have this problem anymore. The last line is brilliant. Wasn't it a fair exchange when each was glad to have the change? I don't know, is this a way to deal with anxieties about, you know, people like bishops who get up to no good? Is it just some fun? Is it a good way to talk about sexual, what do we call it? People, impotence or whatever. Is it a good way to talk about that? We'll have a story that's, let's put it on a bishop. It's a bit of fun. I don't know, but it's a story. My favourite Fablio, though, is the crucified priest. And again, it just shows some of the playful side of medieval sexuality. It's a good story. It's a woman, she's sleeping with a priest. Her husband is a carpenter who makes crucifixes. And so she's sleeping with the priest. The carpenter goes out, the priest comes in, she's sleeping with him. The carpenter comes home unexpectedly. So the priest is terrified, so he just goes into the workshop and pretends to be one of the crucifixes, like this, and leans up against the cross. Wonderful. The carpenter comes in and says, "Oh, I left something in here. Oh, I know what it is. When I made Christ on the crucifix, I shouldn't have left the penis on because we should cover that up." And then he chips the penis away and castrates him. I don't know why I laughed. That was wrong. And it's It's a lovely story. Again, it's anxieties. Again, is it anxieties about sexuality? Is it a way to talk about adultery in a fun way? Is it okay to describe Christ's penis, even through an image of that being cut off? I don't know. Look, I'm going to leave you with some of these dangling questions. And I suppose the dangling question is, what is lust in the Middle Ages? Is it some track through which we imagine people ascend to something higher? So lust is just like step one of a real cosmic journey that's going to lead you to truth and beauty and understanding. Or is lust something that you should avoid altogether? It's a terrible demonic thing that tempts you and it leads you to ruin. Is it the pain that's going to kill you? Like Helen of Troy or Cleopatra, like get involved with this and your life is over, you'll be in the snake pit. Or is it something that people just live with in a playful way, and maybe in a more playful way than we do now? Maybe these kinds of stories are much more popular than the kind of castration stories. It's been ages since I heard a good castration story in public, but this one was in public. So maybe this is part of the enigma. I'll leave you with these slightly terrifying images of Christ's wound, as imagined in medieval manuscripts, the wound of Christ that he made on the cross, that was made on the cross. I'll leave you with those enigmatic images. Any questions from Zoom? Any questions from you guys? I know it was a long lecture. There was a lot in there. I couldn't control myself. I just went too many slides. But if you have any questions, happy to answer.
I just don't understand. I just don't understand. Maybe you'll clarify this. Why is it okay to think about the Jesus as a kind of the person you might be with? You might have sexual connection. How can it be one of three perfect love lines in the history?
Yeah. The question is, Bernard of Clairvaux said, right, the body is our only tool for salvation, right? You can't get salvation without a body. No one's born without a body, right? So humans need to be saved. They do it through a body, but also their body is resurrected. Why do I say that? The body is important. We're not dealing with a dualism which says, forget the body, abject the body. The body's a corrupt vessel. It's evil. It's the soul that matters. That's not what we have in this period. The body must be part of your journey to salvation, to a happy life, to perfection. So my explanation to that answer to your question is, one logical journey from that principle that the body is the medium for salvation is to see sexual imagery as acceptable within this, but it's important that obviously it's important that it's not real, it's not enacted. It's not like she says there's a man who looks a lot like Jesus and then he pressed again. It's not like that. And it's obviously not literal, although it comes close in some places. Angela Foligno, again, I think it is, describes herself dropping. She strips naked in front of the cross and she embraces it. It does cross the line sometimes. But of course, it's a really strong line, isn't it? It's a really strong line. She's not actually having sex with Jesus, is she? She's definitely not doing that. And she knows that will never happen. So is it just that it's the most powerful bodily metaphor? The most powerful bodily metaphor must have some spark in it that we can apply to these higher things. Maybe it's just much more visual or visceral, or maybe it's just more how she felt. The question comes, when do you start saying that's wrong? Like if you're the moralizer, if you're a priest or a bishop, and she's a woman after all, so they're under certain more scrutiny, right, from men, authorities. When do you start saying you've gone too far? This description is too much. Well, that's a problem we all have in all kinds of forms of expression. She would justify that as poetry, and I think, and say, well, it both is and isn't at the same time. It is 100% a bodily desire for God and for Jesus and his personal being, but it also is more or less than that. It's a symbol, a metaphor. If you ask a poet, who describes something beautiful, you say, did you really mean that, or is it just a metaphor? Of course, they're not going to say, a good poet's not going to say, no, it's just a metaphor. I'm just giving you an idea through words. No, they're going to say it's inseparable from the way I described it. So it's not a great answer, but I think the short answer is it's the most powerful bodily way to experience something that is, self-shatteringly, powerful, right? It's a powerful way to experience something in the body, and that's how she chose to describe that. Yeah, I don't know. I think there are a lot of writers who would say she went too far. Definitely. Any other questions? Yes, please. Okay.
Sorry for my ignorance. I just wanted to find out whether they had any censorship, so some images or figures were forbidden and stuff like that. Was this true for this era when they were told not to demonstrate certain things and, by the government, maybe by the church?
Yeah, that's really good, isn't it? That's a good question. And the reason why it's such a good question is, I try to think, I can't think of, obviously if there was active censorship, it's gone and we don't know the material, but then we would know what has been dictated, do not do this, do not write this. I can't think of any examples of anywhere where it's written, you may not circulate this kind of literature. There are condemnations, like, this stuff is filthy, and this stuff is lewd subject matter, but it's not censorship. There's nothing that we would call pornography either, which is interesting. There's nothing that we would say, oh, that's pornographic. Although what is pornographic? It's something that excites you to feel something.
Was it a form of art, or how to relate to this?
This is the problem I have with this thing. Where is it?
I know that children's stories were quite horrifying in the Middle Ages. I just wonder, maybe this was normal. So.
Yeah, I suppose that's my point I'm making, that there's not the same boundary that we create between sexually obscene and not obscene. Obscene meaning you will not see it, right? Off the scene. Obscene meaning I do not want to see it. There's not the same, there are stories of marriage beds where people have their first night in bed together, and the family are there too. Sometimes in the same room. There's not quite the same policing of this is obscene, this isn't. Yeah. Okay, guys, look, you're released. Thank you so much for coming. To Zoomers, thank you for watching, and you'll get the sound file, and then you can hear it all perfectly. And to you guys, look, I really, really appreciate it. This was a difficult lecture in many ways to give. Pleasure, thanks.